Well, if my music, the way I sing it and play the piano and do it, if it's a part of a communist plot, I'd have to be communist, I guess. Yeah. And I'm not communist. Laying something down I liked. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was good, and I had to get involved with it. I knew that. I was just a child then.
He was the wild man who pounded his piano like it was a weapon, a preacher's son who turned Sunday hymns into Saturday night chaos. Crowds called him the Killer because when Jerry Lee Lewis walked on stage, nothing and no one could survive the storm he unleashed. But behind the flames, behind the hair flying and keys smashing, there was a story darker and more dangerous than any rock song could ever capture. Scandals that destroyed his career, tragedies that haunted his family, and rumors that never stopped chasing him. The man who defined rock and roll's rebellion spent his life running from the very demons that made him famous. And by the time the world finally caught up, Jerry Lee had already left a trail of destruction that no one could ignore. Before the scandals, before the headlines that nearly buried him alive, Jerry Lee Lewis was a boy from Faraday, Louisiana, raised in the Deep South where music meant salvation. He was born into a family of poor farmers in 1935, and while most kids his age dreamed of escaping through hard work or the church, Jerry Lee found his escape sitting in front of a piano. His family saw something in him early. They mortgaged the farm just to buy him his first upright piano, a desperate gamble that would pay off in ways no one could have imagined. From the start, he didn't just play. He attacked the keys like they had done him wrong, blending the gospel he learned in church with the boogie-woogie and blues sneaking in from juke joints down the road. By his teens, he was already a local phenomenon, drawing crowds that couldn't believe the ferocity coming from this skinny kid with wild blonde hair and a voice that sounded like it was already soaked in sin and whiskey. When he landed at Sun Records in Memphis, the same label that had launched Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee didn't waste a second proving he belonged. He burst into the studio, demanding a spot at the piano, and when he laid down Crazy Arms, people knew they were witnessing something new. But it was a whole lot of shakin' going on in 1957 that changed everything. Suddenly, Jerry Lee wasn't just a regional act, he was a national shockwave. The performance was raw, unrestrained, and completely unlike the polished rockabilly that had started to dominate the airwaves. When he played it on TV, pounding the piano, kicking the bench aside, and whipping his hair like a man possessed, America gasped and then couldn't look away. The song shot to the top of the charts, selling millions and cementing Jerry Lee as a rising star in the exploding world of rock and roll. His follow-up, Great Balls of Fire, wasn't just a hit, it was an anthem. Released at a time when rock was still fighting to prove itself, Jerry Lee gave it its most dangerous edge. His snarling vocals, the reckless piano pounding, the suggestive energy, it all terrified parents and thrilled teenagers. Overnight, he became one of the most controversial stars of his time, the kind of performer who seemed to be daring the world to stop him. The press nicknamed him the Killer, not only for the way he killed every crowd, but for the sheer violence of his playing style. He wasn't Elvis with a smirk and a swivel. He wasn't Johnny Cash with a cool baritone. Jerry Lee Lewis was chaos incarnate, a firestorm of sound and attitude that made everyone else look tame. But as his fame skyrocketed, so did the sense of danger surrounding him. He bragged about his talent, telling anyone who would listen that he was the true king of rock and roll, and he meant it. That arrogance made enemies, but it also made headlines. For a brief, electrifying moment, Jerry Lee Lewis looked unstoppable, the living embodiment of rock's raw power. Yet just as he hit the peak, one decision, one scandal, would bring it all crashing down. Just as Jerry Lee Lewis stood on the edge of conquering the world, he lit a fuse that would nearly destroy him overnight. In 1958, at the height of his fame, he boarded a plane for London to kick off his first international tour. The British press was waiting eagerly for America's new rock and roll sensation, expecting wild stories and dazzling performances. What they got instead was a revelation so scandalous it overshadowed his music entirely. As reporters swarmed the young star, one asked about the quiet girl traveling with him. Jerry Lee, brash as ever, introduced her as his wife, Myra Gale Brown. The problem? Myra was just 13 years old. Even worse, she was his cousin. In an instant, Jerry Lee went from rock's new king to its most reviled figure. The press exploded with outrage. Headlines called him immoral, a disgrace, a symbol of everything parents feared about rock and roll. Concerts were canceled, radio stations banned his songs, and ticket sales plummeted. His UK tour, meant to crown him as an international star, collapsed within days as angry crowds and officials turned against him. In America, the backlash was just as fierce. He was booed, blacklisted, and virtually erased from the charts. For years, the scandal clung to him like a curse, reducing one of the most exciting performers of the era to a cautionary tale. The fallout wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Myra herself later revealed the pressures and isolation she endured, trapped in a marriage the world condemned. For Jerry Lee, though, it was another battlefield. He dug in, defiantly telling anyone who asked that he'd done nothing wrong, that his private life was nobody's business.
When were you married?
Pardon?
When were you married?
Well, we leave our personal questions out of this, sir.
All right, well, good.
But the truth was clear. The scandal had slammed the brakes on his career at the very moment he was poised to eclipse Elvis Presley. He had gone from selling out arenas to playing small, half-empty clubs, fighting to prove that his talent could outshine his reputation. This was the moment that could have ended him completely. Other stars would have faded into obscurity, crushed under the weight of public disgrace. But Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't built to disappear quietly. He was reckless, stubborn, and unwilling to surrender, even if the world turned its back. The same fire that made him pound his piano until it shook the floor now pushed him to keep performing, keep recording, keep fighting for a chance to reclaim his place. And in one of the most unlikely comebacks in rock history, that chance came years later, not in America but in a smoky German nightclub, where Jerry Lee would deliver a performance so explosive it would remind the world why they had feared and loved him in the first place. By the early 1960s, Jerry Lee Lewis seemed like a ghost of rock and roll's early explosion. The scandal with Myra had nearly erased him from the charts, leaving him to scrape together shows in dingy bars and forgotten roadhouses, while younger stars like Elvis, Buddy Holly, and the new wave of British acts took center stage. But Jerry Lee wasn't done, not by a long shot. In 1964, when most people thought his career was finished, he walked into a German nightclub called the Star Club in Hamburg, and what happened that night would go down in history as one of the most ferocious live performances ever captured on tape. The Star Club itself was legendary, the same stage where the Beatles had sharpened their teeth before conquering the world. But on that night, when Jerry Lee Lewis sat down at the piano, it wasn't just a performance, it was an exorcism. Backed by the Nashville teens, he tore through his old hits with a rawness and fury that made the polite versions on record sound tame. He pounded the keys with such violence that the piano seemed ready to collapse, shouting and howling as if he had been waiting years to remind the world who he really was. Songs like Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On and Great Balls of Fire didn't just get played, they were detonated, transformed into explosions of sound and rage that filled the club with an energy few had ever witnessed. Critics later called the album Live at the Star Club, Hamburg, one of the greatest live rock records of all time. Even today, musicians and historians point to it as proof that Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't just a pioneer, he was a force of nature. Unlike the carefully polished studio albums that defined most of the 1960s, this performance was wild, unfiltered, and unapologetic. It wasn't about clean notes or perfect timing. It was about raw survival. Jerry Lee had been counted out, mocked, and forgotten, but here he was, unleashing the kind of power that no scandal could bury. For Jerry Lee, this wasn't just a comeback concert. It was a statement. He was reminding everyone, from fans to critics to his rivals back in the States, that he wasn't just some washed-up scandal. He was still the killer, still the man who could set fire to a piano and leave audiences gasping. And while the record didn't immediately return him to chart dominance, it carved his legend deeper into rock history. If Elvis was the face of rock and roll, Jerry Lee was its snarling soul, the uncontainable energy that refused to be silenced. But even the most explosive comeback couldn't erase the shadows. The same recklessness that made Jerry Lee a legend also haunted his personal life. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, he would reinvent himself once again, not as a rock and roll rebel, but as a country crooner who found unexpected redemption in Nashville. By the late 1960s, rock and roll had changed, and so had Jerry Lee Lewis. The scandal still haunted him. The British invasion had shifted the spotlight, and younger audiences were chasing new idols. But instead of fading away, Jerry Lee made a move that shocked everyone. He turned to country music. For a man known as the wildest of rock's early rebels, the decision seemed almost impossible to imagine. But it worked. In 1968, he released Another Place, Another Time, and suddenly the critics who had written him off were forced to pay attention. The single What's Made Milwaukee Famous Has Made a Loser Out of Me became a hit, and with it, Jerry Lee proved that he wasn't chained to one genre. He could swap the raw chaos of rock for the slow burn of heartbreak ballads and still sound authentic. Through the 1970s, he dominated the country charts in ways most fans didn't expect. Songs like She Even Woke Me Up to Say Goodbye, There Must Be More to Love Than This, and Would You Take Another Chance on Me brought him back into the mainstream. His piano playing, always explosive in rock, became soulful and haunting in country, carrying the weight of someone who had truly lived through heartache and scandal. The irony was hard to miss. While rock radio had abandoned him, country audiences embraced him as one of their own, drawn to the raw honesty in his voice. He became a staple at the Grand Ole Opry, an icon not just of rebellion, but of redemption. Jerry Lee's gospel roots also resurfaced during this time. Raised in a deeply religious family, he had once wrestled with the idea that rock and roll was the devil's music. Now, with his career rebuilt, he often returned to gospel recordings, pouring out the conflict that had chased him since childhood. It was as if he was always caught between salvation and sin, torn between the church pew and the honky-tonk. This tension gave his music a depth few others could match. While some stars sang about pain as an idea, Jerry Lee sang about it as a reality. The industry began to acknowledge his second act. He collected awards, sold out tours, and in 1986 he was inducted into the inaugural class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame alongside Elvis, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. Later, in 2022, just months before his death, he was finally recognized by the Country Music Hall of Fame, an honor that tied together both halves of his career. Through it all, Jerry Lee stayed true to his nature. He never played it safe, never softened his edges, and never let the scandals erase his talent. But the truth was, success didn't tame him. Behind the scenes, his life remained as volatile as ever. Multiple marriages, family tragedies, brushes with the law, Jerry Lee lived off stage with the same reckless abandon that had once electrified audiences. Fame might have given him redemption in the public eye, but privately, chaos still followed him everywhere. And before long, that chaos would once again explode into headlines the world couldn't ignore. For all his musical reinventions, Jerry Lee Lewis could never outrun the storm of his personal life. If anything, the chaos only grew louder as the years went on. His career revival in country music gave him back the spotlight. But behind the curtain, Jerry Lee was still the killer, living recklessly and leaving a trail of broken marriages, scandals, and shocking incidents. He was married 7 times, often moving from one relationship to the next with the same intensity he brought to the stage. Myra Gale Brown, the child bride whose marriage nearly ended his career, was only the beginning. Each new union seemed to bring fresh drama, allegations of abuse, fights that spilled into the tabloids, and heartbreak that left scars on everyone involved. His life became a revolving door of passion and destruction, proof that Jerry Lee lived as fast at home as he did under the lights. The violence wasn't just emotional. In 1976, Jerry Lee shot his bass player Butch Owens during a drunken argument. Though Owens survived, the story once again fed the legend of Jerry Lee as dangerous and unpredictable. That same year, he was arrested outside Elvis Presley's Graceland with a pistol in his car, demanding to see Elvis. The bizarre scene ended with Jerry Lee being hauled away by police, while Elvis, himself spiraling in private, watched from inside. Some fans later whispered that the two men, often compared as rivals, were mirror images, both raised in religious Southern families, both icons of rebellion, and both consumed by excess. But where Elvis's story ended in tragedy in 1977, Jerry Lee somehow kept stumbling forward, surviving one self-inflicted disaster after another. The tragedies in his family were no less haunting. In 1962, his 3-year-old son, Steve Allen Lewis, drowned in a swimming pool accident. In 1973, his eldest son, Jerry Lee Lewis Jr., died in a car crash at just 19. These losses shook him to his core, though in public he rarely showed vulnerability. Instead, He buried the pain in his music and in his destructive lifestyle, leaning harder on alcohol and pills to numb the grief. By the 1980s, years of hard living had taken their toll. He battled ulcers, health crises, and multiple brushes with death, but still refused to slow down. Doctors warned him to quit drinking and change his ways, yet Jerry Lee always seemed convinced that rules didn't apply to him. By the time Jerry Lee Lewis entered the final chapters of his life, his body bore every scar of the chaos he had unleashed. Decades of hard living had left him frail, but he refused to surrender his place at the piano. Even as his peers died young, Elvis, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee carried the title of survivor. In 2006, he stunned the industry with Last Man Standing, an album that featured duets with legends like Mick Jagger, Bruce Springsteen, and Jimmy Page. The record's title wasn't just clever marketing, it was the truth. Jerry Lee had outlived nearly every one of his contemporaries, and he wore it like a badge of honor. He was no longer just a scandal-plagued rock star. He was the living, breathing link to the birth of rock and roll, a reminder of the days when the music was raw, dangerous, and untamed. Even as his health declined, he kept recording. In 2014, he released Rock and Roll Time, an album that critics praised for its grit and honesty. His voice was older, raspier, but it carried the weight of survival, of a man who had seen and lost almost everything yet refused to let go of the fire that made him famous. In 2019, a serious stroke nearly ended his ability to play piano, and many assumed it was finally the end. But in true Jerry Lee fashion, he shocked everyone by relearning how to play, clawing his way back to the instrument that had defined his life. Recognition finally caught up with him. In 1986, he was inducted into the very first class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, cementing his place alongside the legends he had once rivaled. But perhaps the most symbolic honor came in 2022, just months before his death, when he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. The man who had shocked and outraged the industry decades earlier was now celebrated as one of its greatest icons. Ill health prevented him from attending the ceremony in person, but the gesture meant everything. It was as if the industry was finally admitting that no matter the scandals, no matter the destruction, Jerry Lee Lewis had left an impact too great to ignore. When he passed away on October 28, 2022, at the age of 87, the tributes poured in from every corner of the music world. Fans, critics, and fellow musicians alike reflected on the contradictions of his life. The brilliance and the recklessness, the gospel roots and the hell-raising lifestyle, the piano genius and the self-sabotaging man. For some, he would always be the scandal, the figure who crossed lines that could never be forgotten. For others, he was the purest embodiment of rock and roll itself, a sound that didn't care about rules, reputations, or restraint. When the curtain finally fell on Jerry Lee Lewis's life, the question wasn't whether he had made history, it was how history would remember him. Was he the scandal-ridden outlaw who nearly destroyed his own career before it began? Or was he the raw, unfiltered genius who gave rock and roll its most dangerous edge? The truth is that Jerry Lee was never one or the other. He was both. He was a preacher's son who grew up fearing damnation. Yet he spent his life chasing sin with a grin and a piano bench flying across the stage. He was the man who shocked the world by marrying a child cousin. Yet he was also the man who delivered performances so electrifying they redefined what music could be. Every part of his story was contradiction, a constant battle between the fire of his faith and the fire in his blood. That's what made him so unforgettable. Elvis may have had the crown, Chuck Berry the riffs, and Little Richard the flamboyance. But Jerry Lee Lewis was something different, something wilder. He didn't just perform rock and roll, he embodied it, living recklessly, playing violently, and daring the world to keep up. His pianos were left battered, his personal life often destroyed, but his legend only grew stronger with each comeback. Even his scandals, the very things that nearly ended him, became part of the mythology. To some, they made him irredeemable. To others, they made him authentic. The man who never pretended to be clean, never played by the rules, and never apologized for being exactly who he was. And maybe that's why his music still matters. Because beyond the wreckage of his personal choices, the violence, the tragedies, and the controversies, the sound of Jerry Lee Lewis at a piano is still pure electricity. It's a reminder of a time when music felt dangerous, when it terrified parents and thrilled teenagers, When one man could pound a set of keys and make the entire world stop and listen, few artists could ever capture that spirit, and fewer still could survive long enough to see it honored. Jerry Lee Lewis did both. So how do we remember him? Not as a saint, not as a villain, but as the embodiment of rock and roll's contradictions. Reckless and brilliant, destructive and divine, he was both the cautionary tale and the standard bearer. The killer lived louder, burned brighter, and outlasted almost everyone. And in the end, when the last note faded, he left behind exactly what he always wanted. Not just songs, but a legend. A legend too messy to be rewritten, too wild to be ignored, and too powerful to ever die.